Colleen Ashby had run Second Chance Animal Shelter for 20 years, and she had never once, in all that time, made a phone call at 3 in the morning that she expected anyone to actually answer. "Wyatt," she said. When he picked up on the second ring, the generator failed. "The heat's out. It's 9 degrees outside and dropping, and I've got 61 animals in a building that's losing warmth by the minute." Wyatt Solis was already reaching for his boots before she finished the sentence. "I'm coming," he said. 2 words, and he meant every part of them. What happened over the next 5 hours would end with 217 motorcycles lining the road outside a small animal shelter in Cotter's Mill, New Hampshire, and a town waking up to find out exactly how far a community could stretch itself in the hours before dawn when something worth saving was on the line. Cotter's Mill sat in the White Mountain foothills, a town of fewer than 2,000 people where winter arrived early and stayed late. And Second Chance Animal Shelter had operated out of a converted feed barn on the edge of town for 2 decades, kept afloat by donations, a skeleton crew of volunteers, and Colleen's own refusal to ever turn away an animal with nowhere else to go. Wyatt Solis was 41 years old, ran a small electrical contracting business, and had been a member of the Iron Vow Motorcycle Club for 16 years, volunteering at the shelter every other Saturday since the day. 6 years earlier, he'd walked in looking for a barn cat and walked out with an elderly 3-legged dog named Biscuit that nobody else had wanted to take home. That ice storm had been building for 2 days, the kind of system meteorologists warned about and half the county ignored anyway, and it had finally knocked out power across 3 townships around midnight, taking down lines that would take at least another day to repair. Second Chance's backup generator, an aging unit Colleen had been meaning to replace for 2 winters running but never had the budget for, had sputtered out at 2:30 in the morning, and by the time Colleen woke to the quiet of her own failing space heater in the shelter's back office, the temperature inside the barn had already dropped low enough to worry her about the animals least able to handle it. 2 elderly dogs with health conditions, a litter of 5-week-old kittens too young to regulate their own body heat, and a dozen other animals who'd already survived worse than they should have before ever arriving at her door. Before we get any further, if this is your first time here, hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because the next 5 hours weren't only about one broken generator. They were about a small town discovering, in the coldest hours before sunrise, exactly how many people were willing to show up for 61 animals nobody in that barn could speak up for themselves. Now, back 6 years, to the Saturday Wyatt Solis walked into Second Chance looking for a barn cat. Wyatt had gone to the shelter on a whim 6 years ago, mostly to please a girlfriend who'd since moved on, and had found himself instead standing in front of an elderly 3-legged dog nobody had shown any interest in adopting in the 11 months he'd already spent waiting. Biscuit had looked at him with the particular patience of an animal that had stopped expecting much from people, and Wyatt, without fully deciding to, had signed the adoption paperwork before he'd even finished considering it. He'd been coming back every other Saturday since, helping with whatever needed doing, and had watched Colleen Ashby pour 2 decades of her own retirement savings and nearly all her free time into keeping that barn running for animals most of the county had already given up on. Colleen Ashby was 58 years old, had never married, and had built Second Chance out of nothing after her own childhood dog was turned away from a full shelter and put down before she'd ever gotten the chance to say goodbye. She'd sworn, at 14 years old, that she'd spend her life making sure that never happened to another family if she had any power to stop it, and had spent every year since proving that promise wasn't only a grieving child's overreaction to loss. That night, she'd called 4 other volunteers before Wyatt, each of them either not answering or, once reached, honest about not having the means to help with a problem this size at 3 in the morning in the middle of an ice storm. She'd called Wyatt last, not because she trusted him less, but because she knew how much he already gave the shelter and hated asking for more. "I need space heaters, and I need somewhere warm for at least the kittens and the 2 seniors," Colleen told him. "I don't know who else to call." "You called exactly the right number," Wyatt said. 6 words, and he was already backing his truck out of the driveway. Wyatt arrived at the barn 20 minutes later with every space heater he owned and 2 thick blankets from his own bed, and stood in the doorway for a long moment once he saw the actual scale of what Colleen was facing: 61 animals. Most of them in outdoor adjacent kennels, never designed to hold heat once the ambient temperature dropped this low, with a generator that wasn't coming back online before morning at the earliest. "This is bigger than what either of us can fix alone," Wyatt said, already pulling out his phone. He sent one message to the chapter's group text, 4 sentences describing exactly what Colleen was facing, and by the time he'd finished loading the first round of kittens into the cab of his truck to keep them warm, 3 other members had already replied that they were on their way with generators of their own. Word moved through the iron vow the way it always did once a message like that landed, fast, and gathering more hands with every mile it traveled. A chapter member who ran a small construction business had 2 commercial-grade generators sitting unused in his shop. A veterinary technician who rode with a neighboring chapter offered to come assess the animals most at risk. 3 separate members with spare rooms and empty crates volunteered, within the hour, to take home whichever animals needed emergency fostering until the shelter's power was fully restored. By 4 in the morning, Second Chance's barn had 2 generators running, 4 additional space heaters glowing steady in the coldest corners, and a rotating crew of riders moving animals gently between warmed enclosures, while Colleen directed the operation with the calm precision of a woman who had spent 2 decades preparing, without knowing it, for exactly this kind of night. Engines, first, and then headlights sweeping the icy road outside Second Chance as the sky began its slow shift from black toward gray. 217 motorcycles rolling in from every direction of 3 counties. Riders who'd heard 4 sentences about 61 animals and a generator that failed at the worst possible hour and needed nothing further explained. Engines dying in sequence until the road outside the shelter held nothing but the tick of 217 cooling engines and a silence deep enough that the ice-laden trees along the property line seemed to hold their breath along with everyone gathered beneath them. Some riders had driven 90 minutes through hazardous roads, without hesitating once they read the message. Not one rider treated the morning like a spectacle. They unloaded supplies in quiet, practiced coordination, more generators, more blankets, cases of pet food, portable heating panels donated by a hardware store owner who'd gotten the call at 4:30 and opened his shop early without being asked twice. A woman stepped off her bike near the barn entrance, the regional chapter's road captain, gray-haired, a patch reading animal rescue stitched over her chest. A program the club had quietly built over a decade of exactly these kinds of nights. She found Colleen checking on the last of the kittens and didn't wait for an explanation. "How many still need placement?" 3 words. 9, Colleen said. "The rest can stay warm here now with the generators running. We'll have homes for all 9 within the hour," the road captain said, and turned to relay instructions to the riders already organizing themselves into a system nobody had needed to design out loud. By the time the sun fully cleared the ridge, every animal in Second Chance was warm, fed, and accounted for. The barn holding a settled silence that had nothing to do with cold anymore, only relief. And word of what had happened overnight had reached enough of Cotter's Mill that people began arriving only to see it for themselves. Neighbors who'd driven past that barn for years without a second thought, now standing in the frozen gravel lot with coffee thermoses, offering whatever help was still needed. Colleen stood in the doorway of her shelter, looking out at 217 motorcycles and a parking lot full of neighbors who'd shown up before 7 in the morning for animals most of them had never met, and found herself crying for the first time in longer than she could remember, not from exhaustion, but from something closer to relief finally catching up to her all at once. "Thank you," she whispered to Wyatt, who'd been awake as long as she had, and looked no less moved by the morning than she was. "I don't know how to thank 200 people," she whispered again, half to herself, "but I'm going to try." "You called exactly the right number," Wyatt said again. 6 words, the same ones from 5 hours earlier, and this time neither of them needed to say anything more. Local news picked up the story by that afternoon, and within the week, donations for a permanent industrial generator and a fully renovated heating system had exceeded what Colleen would have needed a decade of fundraisers to collect on her own. The hardware store owner who'd opened early that morning became a standing sponsor for the shelter's utility bills going forward, a partnership neither of them had planned, but both of them kept, without ever discussing ending it. Second Chance Animal Shelter has never lost power again, without a full backup system ready within minutes, and Colleen keeps a framed photograph on her office wall now of that frozen morning lot full of motorcycles. "A reminder," she says, "of exactly how large the word community can turn out to be when it's tested at the worst possible hour." If this story reached you, if you believe that animals who can't ask for help deserve people willing to show up anyway, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs reminding that the coldest hours before dawn are sometimes exactly when the most people turn out to matter. Subscribe to Iron Vow Stories so you never miss the next one. And tell me in the comments, would you have answered that call at 3 in the morning?